All right, guys, we left off where they mixed up those dreams, and now they are on their way to London. So this is called Journey to London. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightgown, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her a wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on the skin that was so soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though they were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him off about 100 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into the whizzing top gear of his, when the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable, so she dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forest, and it was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his high speed sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look quick, quick, over there," he spoke, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those are the other giants all galloping back home after their guzzle," said the BFG. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. "A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight," the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her more than ever determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides. But there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said, "yes, but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in the streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops, but there were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on. But nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide. That was the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London. his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have thought that they saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street, but even if they had, they would have never believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion, blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from the cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her underneath-breath voice. "I is in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost." "But why?" "Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures." "Don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "You see that huge roundabout just ahead across outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That's the Hyde Park corner." Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park corner. Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch. That's a statue of a horse and a rider on top of it. Can you see it?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I seen it," said the BFG. "Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park corner, over the arch, and over the horse and the rider, and land on the pavement on the other side?" "Easy," the BFG said. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "I promise," the BFG said. "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of the Hyde Park corner." "Don't get so flustered," the BFG said. "To me, that is a snitchy little jump. There's not a tingle-dingling to it." "Then go," Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a gallop and went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings and that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement to the other side. "Well done," Sophie whispered. "Now quick, over that wall." Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with a fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. "We're here," Sophie whispered excitedly. "We're in the Queen's back garden." All right, the next chapter is called The Palace. "By gumdrops," whispered the big friendly giant. "Is this really it?" "There's the palace," Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and tidied flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. "But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least," he said. "Easily, I should think," Sophie whispered. "Then I is boggled," the BFG said. "How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping?" "Let's go a bit closer and have a look," Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began swiveling around. "Hey," Sophie whispered, "you're going to tip me out." "Shh," the BFG whispered back. "I was hearing something." He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that, and Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from being tumbled out. BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man paddling softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. "You was telling me they has no soldiers in the back of the garden," the BFG whispered. "He wasn't a soldier," Sophie whispered. "He was some sort of a watchman. We'll have to be careful." I is not too worried," the BFG said. "These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the most noise of a man breathing the other side of this garden. How much longer before it begins to get light? Sophie whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even though he was walking on gravel. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back of the wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going through Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one that Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening for? Sophie whispered back. For breathing, the BFG whispered. I is able to tell if it's a man, human being, or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snortling a little bit too. He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black-coated body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. No, he whispered. This room's empty, he whispered. Then he listened in on several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. Then he came to a window in the very center of the palace, and he listened, but he did not move on. Ho, ho, he whispered. We has a lady sleeping in there. Sophie felt a little quiver running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto the walls. It was a large room, a lovely room. Rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and a pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face that she had seen on stamps and coins and in newspapers all of her life. For a few seconds she was speechless. Is that her? The BFG whispered. Yes, Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. Then the BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow dreams into the children's bedrooms. Some windows got stuck, some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's windows slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains, and then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window. But behind the curtains, now don't you go tip-toppling backwards, the BFG whispered. You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill. Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was only wearing her thin nightgown. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, but not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightgown from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid, and now very cautiously he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains far into the room, aiming it at a high place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath, he puffed out his cheeks, and poof, he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very carefully, like a thermometer. Is you all right sitting there? He whispered. Yes, Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder, and the ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. So there's the BFG blowing the dream. How long will the dream take to work? Sophie whispered. Some takes an hour, the BFG whispered back. Some is quicker, some is slower still, but it is sure to find her in the end. Sophie said nothing. I is going off to wait in the garden, the BFG whispered. When you is wanting me, just call out my name, and I is coming very quick. Will you hear me? Sophie whispered. You is forgetting these, whispered the BFG, smiling and pointing at his great big ears. Goodbye, Sophie whispered. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He simply melted away into the dark garden. All right. So that's the end of that chapter for today. And we do have some chapters left of the book, but with this being the last week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to finish it up over the summer. I'm going to be linking my little virtual classroom with stuff about summer reading and different things on our PTA Facebook page. And if you want to make a copy of this link that's on Google Classroom, because you're not going to be able to access Google Classroom over the summer, you can keep it somewhere. Just keep it in your email. Maybe keep it on like an open document somewhere so that you can keep going back to it. I would advise you to do that so that you can continue to come back to it. And then, like I said, it'll also be on our PTA Facebook page so that you can return to it, because I will update these YouTube links with the continuing of reading this book. All right, thank you guys, and I will see you later. Bye.